Okay, stop. Before you assume this is a video about mean kids on a playground, it isn't. This is a video about something much older, much stranger, and honestly much more violent than anything happening at recess. Because for most of human history, the punishment for being a bully wasn't detention. It wasn't a stern talking to from a teacher, or a passive-aggressive note from HR. In a lot of documented cases, it was permanent exile from everyone you'd ever known, and in some cases, it was death, agreed upon in advance, by the entire community. Let that sink in for a second. Somewhere in your family tree, going back far enough, there were people sitting around a fire having a very serious conversation about what to do with the guy who kept taking more than his share of the meat. And today we're going to trace that instinct all the way from hunter-gatherer bands, through ancient Athens, through Rome, through medieval Europe, and finally into the evolutionary psychology sitting quietly in the back of your own skull right now. We're asking one question. Why do humans, in basically every culture anyone has ever studied, absolutely lose their minds when one person tries to dominate the group? This is the video nobody made until now. Let's go! Here's the big idea, and it's going to reframe a few things for you. For roughly 95% of human history, we didn't live in cities. We didn't have police. We didn't have courts, judges, or a legal system you could appeal to if someone wronged you. We lived in small bands, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 people, and our survival depended almost entirely on everybody cooperating, sharing meat after a hunt, sharing information about where the water was this season, sharing childcare so somebody could actually get some sleep. A band that couldn't cooperate didn't just have a bad vibe, it starved, or got picked off by predators, or lost fights with rival bands. Cooperation wasn't a nice-to-have. It was the entire operating system. So now picture one guy in that band deciding he wants more meat than everyone else, or that he gets to boss the other hunters around, or that he can intimidate people into just handing over their stuff. In a modern office, that guy gets a passive-aggressive performance review and maybe a strongly worded email from HR. In a hunter-gatherer band 40,000 years ago, that same guy was an existential threat to the entire group's survival, and everybody around that fire knew it. Which sets up the central tension we're going to follow through this whole video. Do you tolerate the bully and risk the group falling apart from resentment and unequal treatment? Or do you punish him and risk him coming after you personally, one-on-one, when you're the only one standing there? Spoiler, humans found some remarkably creative answers to that dilemma, and a lot of them are more brutal than anything you'll see on network television tonight. And here's what makes this genuinely worth 40,000 years of attention rather than one uncomfortable staff meeting. This wasn't a rare problem that popped up once or twice and got handled. It was a recurring, guaranteed feature of every single human group that ever existed, because wherever you get more than a handful of people cooperating for a common goal, you will eventually get somebody who realizes they can take more than they give and probably get away with it. Every band, every village, every city, every office has run into this exact same problem over and over for the entire span of human history. The tools changed. Stone tools became pottery, shards became legal statutes, became a strongly worded group chat message. The underlying instinct never did. Let's start with the anthropology, because this is where things get genuinely wild, and where most of this video's best material comes from. There's an anthropologist named Christopher Baim who spent decades studying small-scale societies, foraging bands in Africa, hunter-gatherers in South America, and comparable groups elsewhere, trying to figure out how egalitarian societies actually stayed egalitarian. His answer became a concept called reverse dominance hierarchy, and it is one of the more quietly mind-blowing ideas in anthropology. Normally, when we picture hierarchy in the animal kingdom, we picture an alpha sitting at the top, pushing everyone else down beneath him. Boehm's research suggests early human bands flipped that arrangement almost entirely on its head. Instead of one dominant individual controlling the group as a whole dominated any individual who tried to rise too high. And they had an entire toolkit built for exactly this purpose. It started small. Gossip, mockery. If a guy started acting a little too big for his loincloth, people would make fun of him, first behind his back and eventually right to his face, in front of everyone. Public teasing, deployed specifically and deliberately to shrink an inflated ego back down to a manageable size, Researchers call this leveling behavior, and it's remarkably consistent across foraging societies studied over the last century, from the Kalahari to the Arctic. If mockery didn't work, the next escalation was ostracism. The group would simply stop including the guy, no more shared meat coming his way, no more invitations on the hunt, no more conversation around the fire when he sat down near it. And here's the part that makes this genuinely terrifying rather than just socially awkward. In a world with no supermarkets, no solo survival strategy, and no way to just move to a new town and start over, being cut off from your group wasn't an inconvenience. It was close to a death sentence, slow and mostly guaranteed. And if a guy somehow pushed through all of that, kept trying to dominate, kept monopolizing resources or intimidating people even after being mocked and shunned, Bohm documented actual cases, real, ethnographically recorded cases, of bands coming together and collectively deciding to execute him, not one furious rival sneaking up on him alone in the dark, which would just be a personal vendetta and a dangerous one at that. The whole group agreeing together, planning it together, because that was genuinely the only safe way to deal with someone too dangerous for any single person to confront on their own. Does the absence of a written record from 40,000 years ago mean this wasn't happening constantly? Almost certainly not. The anthropological record from foraging societies studied within living memory suggests this wasn't some rare, one-off event. It was a functioning, load-bearing part of how these societies stayed stable for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone had the bright idea to write any of it down. Here's a fun fact that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. In some of the foraging societies Bohm studied, successful hunters would deliberately downplay their own kills. A hunter who brought down a large animal wouldn't brag about it. He'd walk back into camp and describe the kill as small, unimpressive, barely worth the trip. Anthropologists sometimes call this insulting the meat, and at first glance it looks like pure modesty. It isn't. It's a defense mechanism. If you talk yourself up as the guy who provides for everyone, you start looking exactly like the dominant, self-important type the whole group is primed to knock back down a peg. So the smartest hunters learned to shrink themselves on purpose, preemptively, before anyone else had to do it for them, which tells you something worth carrying into the rest of this video. The pressure to avoid becoming a bully was often just as powerful as the pressure to punish one, because everybody in that camp had grown up watching exactly what happened to the guy who got a little too full of himself. Fast forward a very long way, all the way to ancient Athens, and you'll find a system that feels almost like a polished, bureaucratic upgrade of that exact same instinct. It's called ostracism, and it might be one of the strangest institutions in the entire history of democracy. Once a year, Athenian citizens could hold a vote, and this wasn't a vote about a law, or a policy, or a war. It was a vote about a specific human being. Every citizen who wanted to participate would take a broken piece of pottery, called an ostracon, literally where the word ostracism comes from, and scratch a name onto it with a stylus. If enough votes piled up against one particular guy, he had 10 days to pack up and leave the entire city. For 10 years. No trial required. No specific crime needed. You didn't have to steal anything. You didn't have to kill anyone. You didn't have to break a single written law. You just had to become a little too popular, a little too ambitious, a little too much like someone who might one day try to make himself a tyrant, and the city decided to remove the possibility before it ever became an actual problem. Sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely wild piece of political engineering. This is a system explicitly built to punish potential rather than action. Athens had recently lived through a period of actual tyrants seizing power by exactly this kind of slow accumulation of popularity and influence, and ostracism functioned as a pressure release valve, letting ordinary citizens boot out anyone gathering a dangerous amount of momentum before he got the chance to actually use it against them. Archaeologists have found piles of these ostraca in the Athenian agora, some inscribed with the exact same handful of names over and over again, which suggests some poor guy was genuinely getting nominated year after year by the same handful of rivals holding a grudge. There's even a famous, probably apocryphal story about a man voting to ostracize the statesman Aristides simply because he was tired of hearing everyone call him Aristides the Just. Imagine getting exiled from your entire city, your home, your business, your family's graves, for an entire decade, because enough people simply found you a bit much. Rome took that same underlying instinct and turned it into something even more psychologically brutal. Because Rome figured out something the Athenians only partially grasped. You don't always need to physically remove someone from the city. You just need to destroy their standing while leaving them right there to live with it. The Romans had a legal and social status called infamia, and it functioned as the ancient world's version of a permanent, public, essentially unremovable stain on your name. If you were convicted of certain disgraceful acts or were simply perceived as having behaved dishonorably, cowardice in battle, cheating in business dealings, certain categories of sexual conduct, working in professions Romans considered shameful, you could be formally marked as infamous. And once that happened, real legal consequences followed immediately. You could lose the right to represent yourself in court. You could lose the right to hold public office ever again. You could lose the ability to serve as a witness or bring certain lawsuits at all. But the legal penalties were almost secondary to the social ones, and this is the part that's genuinely clever in an unsettling way. Rome was an intensely reputation-driven culture, obsessed with honor, standing, and public perception, and once you were infamous, doors closed all over the city. Dinner invitations quietly stopped arriving. Political alliances evaporated overnight. Business partners suddenly had somewhere else to be. The Romans had essentially figured out that shame is cheaper than execution, and often just as effective at neutralizing someone who's become a problem. You don't have to kill the guy throwing his weight around the forum. You just have to make sure everyone knows exactly what he did and let the social consequences finish the job for you, slowly, publicly, and without you ever having to lift a finger. And the Romans didn't stop at legal status. They had an entire genre of graffiti and satirical verse dedicated to publicly humiliating people who got too big for their togas, scrawled on walls all over the city, naming names, mocking specific politicians and generals for specific failures. Wait, that's clever. In a way that feels uncomfortably familiar if you've ever opened a social media app in the last decade. Rome figured out, 2,000 years early, that a joke repeated by enough people does more lasting damage to a powerful man's reputation than almost any punishment a court could hand down. Medieval Europe leaned into that exact same idea, public humiliation as a form of justice, and then went a step further and built entire pieces of civic architecture around it. Walk into most medieval town squares and you'd find stocks or a pillory sitting right there in the open, a wooden frame that locked a person's head and hands in place, positioned right in the middle of everyone's daily foot traffic to the market. And the point of the stocks was never really about the physical discomfort, even though sitting hunched over in one for hours on end was genuinely miserable on the body. The point was that everyone walking to buy their bread that morning got to see you there. Your neighbors saw you. Your in-laws saw you. The people you owed money to saw you, and probably enjoyed it a little too much. There was also the cucking stool, sometimes called the ducking stool, used specifically for people, often women, accused of gossiping too much, scolding their husbands, or generally being disruptive to the peace of the community, which strapped the offender into a chair mounted on a long beam and sometimes dunked them into a pond or river in front of an assembled crowd of onlookers. And notice what all of these medieval punishments have in common. They are not primarily built around inflicting pain. They are built around inflicting an audience. Medieval justice had rediscovered, entirely independently, something Boehm's foragers already knew instinctively tens of thousands of years earlier, that for a fundamentally social animal, being humiliated in front of your entire community is often a far more effective deterrent than being hurt privately ever could be. Nobody wants to be the story people tell at the well for the next 30 years. There was also a custom in parts of England and France known as rough music, or in some regions a skimmington ride, where the community would organize an impromptu, deafening parade, banging pots and pans, blowing horns, sometimes marching in effigy of the offender through the streets on a donkey, backwards, so everyone could get a good look. It wasn't ordered by any court. There was no judge, no formal charge, no paperwork. It was simply the community itself, spontaneously deciding that someone, often a bully, a domestic tyrant, or a notorious cheat, needed to be reminded exactly how the whole village felt about him, loudly, at midnight, outside his own front door. It's basically reverse dominance hierarchy again, just with better instruments. So why does this exact pattern keep showing up again and again in foragers, in Athenians, in Romans, in medieval villagers, all independently landing on some version of collective, public, reputation-based punishment, rather than one person simply walking up and confronting the bully directly? This is where evolutionary psychology gets genuinely interesting, and where a lot of researchers point straight at gossip itself. Not gossip as some kind of character flaw or a waste of time at the office water cooler, but gossip as a piece of evolved social technology, quietly doing an enormous amount of work. Think about the actual mechanics of confronting a dominant, aggressive person all by yourself. It's genuinely dangerous. He's bigger, or he has more social connections, or he's simply more willing to escalate a conflict than you are, and a direct, one-on-one confrontation is a fight you might very well lose, possibly badly. But gossip lets an entire group quietly compare notes, without any single person ever having to have that dangerous, individual confrontation on their own. One person mentions he took more than his fair share of the last kill. Another person mentions he threatened somebody last week over nothing. A third person remembers he's done this exact thing twice before. Suddenly, the whole band is holding the same information at the same time and can act together, all at once, with overwhelming numbers on their side. That's the many against one dynamic in action, and it's a genuinely elegant solution to a genuinely hard evolutionary problem. A single unarmed person cannot safely challenge a determined bully. 50 people who all agree at the same moment absolutely can, and the bully knows it too, which is often enough to stop the behavior before it even escalates that far. Some researchers argue this coordination mechanism is one of the deepest roots of human morality itself, not some abstract sense of right and wrong handed down from a mountaintop, but a practical, on-the-ground survival mechanism for coordinating punishment against free riders and exploiters without any one person ever having to risk a solo fight they might lose. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued, and this is genuinely one of the more debated claims in the field, that gossip may have been one of the original functions of human language itself. Not poetry, not hunting instructions, gossip. Before we were composing epics or negotiating trade routes, we may have simply been keeping tabs on who in the group could be trusted and who was quietly helping themselves to more than their share. It's not a flattering origin story for language, but it's a remarkably practical one, and it would explain why humans, of every age, in every culture, seem to find almost nothing more irresistible than a good piece of news about someone else's bad behavior. And this is exactly why direct confrontation still feels so uniquely awful today, even in situations with zero physical danger attached. Telling a coworker to their face that they're taking credit for your work triggers something ancient and disproportionate in your nervous system, a sense that you are about to personally, solo, take on a threat that used to require the whole tribe. Meanwhile, mentioning it to a different coworker over coffee feels almost effortless by comparison. That's not you being cowardly. That's 40,000 years of finely tuned risk assessment, quietly running in the background, telling you that the safer path has always been to build a coalition first and confront second, if you have to confront at all. Which brings us to the actual mechanism behind all of it, the one that explains basically everything we've covered so far. Confronting a dominant individual alone is expensive and risky. Confronting them as a coordinated group is cheap and safe, at least for any individual member of that group. Evolution tends to favor whatever strategy is cheap and safe over whatever strategy is expensive and risky every single time, given enough generations to sort it out. So it makes a strange kind of sense that humans evolved incredibly sensitive radar for detecting free riders, cheaters, and dominant exploiters, alongside an equally sensitive radar for figuring out exactly how many other people share our low opinion of that person before we ever say a word out loud. We check the room before we commit. We test the waters with a raised eyebrow or a quiet comment to a friend, and if we get a nod back, the coalition starts forming. This is arguably why humans are so obsessed with reputation, why we care so intensely what other people think of us, and why the fear of being talked about behind our backs feels almost primal in a way that fear of, say, a parking ticket simply does not. Because for most of human history, being talked about behind your back wasn't a minor social inconvenience. It was step one of a process that could genuinely end with you being left behind at the last camp, or worse. Let's pull this together now, because there are a few threads worth tying off before we close things out. First, humans appear to be wired, at a level well below conscious thought, to notice and collectively punish people who try to dominate or exploit the group. And this instinct is old, Likely far older than agriculture, far older than writing, and quite possibly older than complex language itself as we understand it today. Second, our modern discomfort with direct confrontation. The fact that most of us would genuinely rather vent to a friend than confront someone face to face probably isn't some kind of moral failing or sign of modern softness that our ancestors would be ashamed of. It might be the exact same evolved strategy our ancestors were already running in those hunter-gatherer bands, just now running on office Slack channels and group chats instead of firelight and shared meat. Third, and this is the one that tends to genuinely stick with people afterward, social punishment predates law. It predates courts. It predates written codes of conduct. It predates almost everything we normally associate with civilization itself. Long before anyone ever wrote down a single formal rule, groups of humans were already enforcing their own rules, informally, collectively, and sometimes with a level of severity that would make a modern courtroom blush. And fourth, and this one is easy to miss, none of this required a central authority to work. No king ordered the reverse dominance hierarchy into existence. No emperor invented infamia and handed it down from a throne. These were bottom-up systems, invented independently, over and over, by ordinary people who had simply noticed the same problem and arrived at strikingly similar solutions, which is exactly what you'd expect if the underlying instinct is baked into us rather than copied from one culture to the next. So, the next time you watch a group quietly turn on someone who's been throwing their weight around, at work, in a friend group, in any group chat anywhere on the internet, you're not watching something new or something uniquely modern. You're watching one of the oldest social technologies humans ever developed, still running exactly as designed, just with better lighting and considerably worse pottery. We didn't invent this behavior. We inherited it, fully assembled, from people sitting around fires who had already figured out tens of thousands of years before Athens or Rome or a single stock in a single town square that the group always beats the bully, eventually, one way or another.